Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to break down a really complex and honestly surprisingly sudden conflict over a tiny, remote set of islands in the South Atlantic. This was a war that was sparked by pure desperation, it was defined by a huge miscalculation, and believe it or not, its legacy is still being felt right now.
All right, so let's jump right in. But here's the thing. We're not going to start with the war itself. No, we're going to start with the desperate, almost crazy idea that sparked the whole thing. See, this wasn't just about claiming some islands. This was about pure survival for a government that was totally failing.
So, you gotta ask, why? Why did Argentina actually invade back in 1982? Well, the answer isn't something you're gonna find on a map. No, to really get it, you have to look at the absolute crisis that was happening inside the country at the time.
Okay, so the people in charge, this military junta led by a guy named General Leopoldo Galtieri, they were facing a total perfect storm. I mean, the country was just reeling from the insane political violence of what they called the Dirty War. On top of that, the economy was completely collapsing. And public support for this, brutal dictatorship, it had hit rock bottom. They were in seriously deep trouble.
So, what's their big solution? Economic reform? Nope. Democratic elections? Not a chance. Their answer was a gamble. A huge one. The junta had this idea that if they could just reclaim these islands, which, by the way, they call the Malvinas, it would be this massive, popular move. It would get everyone waving the flag, united in this wave of nationalist pride, and hopefully make them forget about all the other terrible stuff going on. But to really get why Argentina felt they had a claim, we have to rewind the clock, way back. Because the history of these islands, wow. It's just a messy, chaotic tangle of different countries all saying, they're mine, for centuries. I mean, for more than 200 years, it feels like everyone had a crack at it. You've got a Dutch explorer who sights them, then a British captain lands and calls them the Falklands. Then a Frenchman comes along, builds the first settlement and calls them Les Malouines, which, eventually turns into Malvinas. Then Spain buys the place from France, but then they leave, which is when a brand new Argentina steps in and says, hey, we're the successors to Spain, so these are ours now. It's like a revolving door of who owns the place.
Okay, so all of that history leads us to the one moment that really, truly matters for this whole story. It's 1833. Argentina has set up a colony, they're there, and then the British just sail back in, kick out the Argentine authorities, and start their own permanent settlement. This one act, this is the thing that becomes the absolute core of Argentina's grievance. It's the claim they would hold on to for the next 150 years.
All right, so fast forward to the 20th century. For decades, Argentina is constantly protesting British control, going through all the proper diplomatic channels. But the talks go absolutely nowhere. And all the while, Britain keeps doing things that just turn up the heat.
So let's just run through a couple of quick examples of how Britain was asserting its control in ways that just drove Argentina crazy. It started with things that might seem kind of small, right? Like back in the 1930s, they issued new postage stamps that spelled it right out. This is British territory. Now, to Argentina, this wasn't just a stamp for a letter. No, this was a provocation printed on paper.
And then you have something like this. In 1981, right before the war, Britain passes a new Nationality Act. Basically, this created a new type of citizenship for people living in places like the Falklands. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a bunch of boring paperwork, right? But for Argentina, this was a huge deal. Giving out these new passports was just another massive step Britain was taking to lock down a claim they thought was totally illegitimate.
And this just captures the whole dynamic perfectly. You have Argentina filing one official protest after another, doing everything by the book. And what's Britain doing? They're just moving on, business as usual, formally making the islands part of their system and basically ignoring all the complaints. You can just feel the frustration in Argentina building and building right up to a breaking point.
Eventually, all that public frustration just boiled over, and you get these incredible, almost movie-like moments. Get this, in 1964, a civilian pilot, a guy named Miguel Fitzgerald, gets so fed up with the politicians getting nowhere that he just flies his own plane to the islands, lands it, plants an Argentine flag, and leaves this note demanding the British leave. Can you imagine? He became an instant national hero overnight.
So now it's 1982. The pressure at home is at a boiling point, and the Argentine junta makes a decision. The time for protests and diplomatic notes, that's over. It was time for military action.
But they made a critical mistake. a miscalculation that would turn out to be fatal for them. See, they looked at Britain, they saw the UK making military budget cuts, and they thought, there's no way they'll fight a war for these tiny islands 8,000 miles from home. But they forgot to account for one huge factor: the person in charge, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady.
And a final spark, the thing that actually lit the fuse for the whole war, came from something almost comically minor. Seriously, a group of Argentine scrap metal workers lands on another nearby island, South Georgia, to take apart an old whaling station. While they're there, they raise an Argentine flag, and suddenly you have a full-blown diplomatic crisis over a flagpole.
So, using this whole scrap metal thing as their excuse, Argentina launched Operation Rosario. On April 2, 1982, Argentine forces hit the beaches on the Falklands. There was a small group of British Royal Marines there, and they fought back, but they were just completely outnumbered and overwhelmed. Just like that, the invasion was a success.
Back in Argentina, people were euphoric. Crowds celebrated in the streets. But that core belief the junta had, that big gamble that Britain wouldn't fight back, well, it was about to be proven wrong, spectacularly wrong, and it happened almost immediately.
Margaret Thatcher's response was swift and furious. She went before Parliament and declared, absolutely, that the islands would be retaken. And what happened next was this incredible feat of logistics. A massive naval task force, we're talking over 100 ships, including aircraft carriers, was thrown together at lightning speed and sent on that 8,000-mile journey down to the South Atlantic.
Then, the British drew a line in the sand, or, I guess, in the water. They declared a total exclusion zone, stretching 200 miles around the islands, and the warning was crystal clear. Any Argentine ship or plane inside this zone would be treated as hostile and would be targeted. The war was about to get very real, very fast.
And things escalated dramatically out on the open sea. First, a British submarine, the HMS Conqueror, sank the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano. Over 300 lives were lost, the single biggest loss of life in the entire war. But just a few days later, Argentina struck back hard. They fired a French-made Exocet missile that hit the British destroyer HMS Sheffield, and it sank. With huge, shocking losses on both sides, any chance of this ending peacefully was just gone.
So after winning control of the sea and the air around the islands, the fight moved on to the land itself. British troops landed and started this absolutely brutal advance across the harsh, freezing, windswept terrain. And they weren't just up against entrenched Argentine soldiers, a lot of whom were young, poorly supplied conscripts. They were also fighting the freezing cold and trying to manage a super long and vulnerable supply line. It was just a brutal slog toward the capital, Stanley.
So, after weeks of really intense, bloody fighting for these key hills and settlements, places like Goose Green and Mount Tumbledown, the British forces finally surrounded the Argentine troops in the capital, Stanley. On June 14, 1982, the Argentines surrendered. And just like that, the 74-day war was over.
The fallout from the war was immediate, and it was huge. In Argentina, this humiliating defeat caused the military junta to just collapse in disgrace, which actually paved the way for democracy to be restored. Over in Britain, the victory sent Margaret Thatcher's popularity through the roof. But here's the crazy part. For all the fighting, all the lives lost, the war didn't actually solve the core problem. To this very day, that fundamental dispute over who owns the islands, it's completely unresolved.
And that brings us right back to the big, lingering question at the very heart of this whole thing. So, after a 74-day war, after hundreds of people died, after a government was toppled, what was resolved? The fundamental disagreement is still sitting right there exactly where it was back in 1982.
You know, there's a final point here that's kind of funny, but also really sharp. After the war, the battlefields were left littered with thousands and thousands of landmines. Obviously, that's a terrifying legacy for any humans there. But for the penguins, their population absolutely boomed. Why? Because they're too light to set off the mines. So maybe, just maybe, after all that human conflict, the penguins are the true winners.